So next up, it's my great pleasure to welcome to the stage to give a short speech about Finland's role in preventing Arctic climate risks from a foreign policy perspective. Please welcome to the stage, Pekka Haavisto.
So good to see all of you here, and good to be here to witness that so many people are now following the Arctic issues and doing something for the Arctic issues. And when I drafted my couple of words, I remembered many years ago my responsibilities as the Minister of Environment, 95 to 99. And there were actually two important meetings that time. First was the establishment of Arctic Council. I was the Finnish representative in Ottawa when Arctic Council was founded. And there were two tasks for this council. One was the protection of the indigenous people and their culture, and the other was combating the climate change and environmental change in the Arctic areas. And now, after all these years, we can evaluate that the things have not been moving so rapidly to the right direction. And I still remember the spring 2019 meeting in Rovaniemi, the Arctic Council meeting, where unfortunately at that time US administration didn't even recognize the importance of the climate change and that something should and could be done for that. That was missing, if I remember correctly, from the resolution of that meeting. The other meeting that I remember very well is 1997 Kyoto meeting. It was the first, I would say, global climate meeting, and of course, then the EU was a very important player around the table in those negotiations. I have to say that I quite many times had to call back home to our, that time, Minister for Trade and Industry and so forth, to convince our Finnish colleagues that something should be done and Finland should be part of it and not abstaining or preventing the decision making that time. It was very tough discussions also nationally. But the interesting part came actually when the final Kyoto Protocol was adopted. The Japanese Minister of Environment burst to tears. And I was thinking that he's crying for happiness because successful conference has been taking place in Kyoto in Japan. But he was crying because this -6 that Japan committed to with the CO2 emission will ruin the economy of Japan. And I really remember all those very emotional feelings that were there around decision makers, but luckily all others didn't burst to tears in that meeting. But that maybe reflects quite well how difficult it was to make the first relevant decisions on climate and also protecting the Arctic. Then when looking at the Finnish Arctic strategy and Arctic planning, our strategy was updated in 2021, and it has 4 priorities. I think you are quite familiar with these. First, of course, the climate change mitigation and adaptation, and recognizing the Arctic areas are warming up more rapidly than other areas, and this will be a disaster, of course, for the whole globe. The other principle was about the inhabitants' welfare issues, Sami and indigenous people's protection, and I think this is still one of our key responsibilities. Also protecting the culture, the languages, the traditions in the Arctic area. The third was actually is the Arctic experience, the research, the science, everything that we know about the nature, climate, environment, how our businesses could adapt to these facts and how we could do more at the research side. And I think this is something that is very close to our heart, of course also including the education. And then infrastructure and logistics, how the population there could be served, but also how in a sustainable way some of the Arctic areas could be used, for example, for telecommunication links and cables and so forth. All this was included in our Arctic strategy. But of course, now we are facing a political situation where problem is also the combination of the 8 countries in the Arctic Council, when one of the countries is Russia. And when the Russian attack against Ukraine started, it meant also downplaying many of those activities of the Arctic Council on the political level that existed or we were planning. My last meeting as a foreign minister with the Arctic Council ministers was spring 2021 in Reykjavik, 8 Arctic foreign ministers sitting around the same table. And I very much remember when that time and still Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that finally the scientists in Russia start to believe that climate change is true, that we politicians have been pushing now for years. And I asked, what does this mean, and how have you been so convinced that this climate change exists? He said, well, we are suffering when the permafrost is melting and the pipelines are collapsing, gas and oil pipelines, so it has a major economic effect in our Arctic areas. So this is witnessing that climate change is true. And somehow I felt that, well, this is maybe beginning for some people to understand that something is really happening in this globe. We also discussed about the other issue, which has been always very close to my heart, because the Russian environmental movements, Russian Greenpeace and others has always been advocating that, and it's picking the nuclear waste around the Novaya Zemlya. That time, Foreign Minister Lavrov mentioned that, well, it was also a mistake to dump the nuclear waste into Arctic areas, and we should have an international project to pick up that nuclear waste around Novaya Zemlya. I couldn't do more than agree with his good idea. But I think again, even that project and that plan certainly is freezed in many ways. One issue that when we are dealing with the Arctic, and I will actually just leave with that thought, is about democracy and democratic decision making and the democratic evaluation of different plans. We can see that many countries have their own plans. There are military plans, there are environmental plans, there are economic plans, there are digging plans for new minerals, or taking them from the bottom of the sea and so forth, and so many different kinds of planning are covering the Arctic area. And I have a feeling that countries and companies do not share all that information. And one day when Arctic Council really should be again alive, that would be, of course, one task to coordinate all these different efforts. But before that, we have to be very cautious about the different type of planning that is taking place in the Arctic areas. And particularly, I'm concerned during these days, all military plans that could exist and take place in the region. When we have more tensions in the world, more tensions in Europe, there will be more tensions also in the Arctic areas. And we should do our utmost to keep Arctic areas out of those tensions. One final remark, which was a lesson to me when talking about the 2 poles, and Finland, of course, has also the scientific interest on the southern pole. As you know, we had a big conference last spring here in Helsinki on that issue. But when discussing about these topics, particularly with the Indians, they always speak about the 3 poles. They say that Himalaya should also be taken into account, that the very similar melting of the glaciers, similar climate effects are taking place in their country, and they should be also partner on all those discussions. And I somehow agree, maybe not on the geographic issue that there are 3 poles, but there are countries that are suffering the same phenomenon with the glaciers. I'm thinking about the Switzerland, I'm thinking about even Kenya, Kilimanjaro area, and so forth. When you look to Akseli Gallen-Kallela painting more than 100 years ago, I guess, or around 100 years ago, you see the glacier and the snow that is covering Kilimanjaro, and today you see different pictures. There are many countries that are sharing this type of interest, which could be scientific, which could be political, and we could really build wider political front to protect the glaciers and the ice cover of the planet. Thank you.